When I think about Qiana Whitted, I have to think about feeling very grateful. Grateful about many things. And I'm going to let you know a little story about this amazing woman, pioneering of so many things. A woman full of talent and passion for the comics, that works for the comic and the development of the profession of many scholars. So that is something that makes her someone very special for all of us. Qiana got her BA at Hampton University in 1996, and an MA in Yale University in 1999, and a PhD in Yale University in 2003. So she graduated from Yale University and on a research on literature, Black literature. So there is a moment in her life where her love of comics bloomed, and we were very lucky. In 2009, at the Art Institute of Chicago, we organized, the executive committee of ICAF, we organized a conference there. And I remember in that time, Cecile was the chair, Cecile Danehi, and we were there. And October 15, 2009, I remember Jeffrey was moderating, and there's this professor from the University of South Carolina giving a presentation of slaves and other some things, Southern history as comic book horror. We were so happy by her presence. We thought she was fantastic. She was very active during the ICAF conference, so we asked her to join us in the executive committee. And in ICAF 2011, we organized that conference in the Center for Cartoon Studies, and Cecile and me, we were co-chairs. She was then a part of the executive committee, and she moderated a round table in comic and pedagogy. And was a very intense conference for me, because it was my goodbye conference. Like, there is a moment when you are in a committee, in an executive committee, creating things that you need to pass the torch. But you need to choose the right people to pass the torch so other people can do and make things go even better and things can grow. So we passed the torch, Cecilia and me, we passed the torch to her. And I'm so happy because things developed very beautifully. So in 2013, they organized ICAF in Oregon, and then back then, alumni Brittany Tullis, now a professor at St. Ambrose, that she was doing research on comics, went there to present on Kinos and Mafalda and femininity. So they joined forces. So Brittany and going with ICAV and with Qiana. So there is a story of how scholars help each other keep growing. So for me, it's very emotional and in that sense, because Cecilia and me, in the beginnings, in the old times, and in the late 90s, we were concerned about more women joining the profession and the research of comics and fighting for comics from that experience and that perspective. And having Qiana doing it, having Brittany doing it, is something that Cecile, that now is not with us, she will be so proud and so happy. So for me, it's a very emotional moment. But Qiana did many other things besides helping scholars in the professions, because she's also is editor in Inks, the Journal of the Comics Studies Society, and she's been co-editor of this beautiful book that is Comics and the U.S. South. So she's been working, but something beautiful happened also. Corey Kremur started editing the comic series, the Comics and Culture series at Rutgers University. And so he saw the opportunity to publish Qiana's book, Easy Comics, Race Shock, and Social Protest, on 2019. So Corey has been working with this series on bringing the best scholars to give amazing books. And for all of us, we felt so proud when Qiana got the Eisner Award. So this beautiful book got the Easy Comics, Race Shock, and Social Protest, published at Rutgers University Press in 2019, was the Will Eisner Comics Industry Award for Best Academic Scholar Book 2020. So there is this beautiful sensation of seeing a scholar reaching the space of comics, bringing, her work, trying to find a space after coming from an amazing work she did as a scholar of literature, and deciding, because she published The Problems of the Evil in 20th Century Black Literature with University of Virginia Press in 2009. 10 years later, she published this amazing comic, Easy Comics book, a scholarly book, and she wins the Will Eisner Award. So for us, it's a very special person here, so that is bringing a lot of knowledge. And Corey, that is, he found Qiana book. He's the one who has the first Desegregating comics, debating blackness in the golden age of American comics. That is a book she edited and is coming out in the next few weeks, but Corey is always ahead of comics, so he has the copy. So I've been over through it, and it's a fantastic piece of many interesting voices, and she's been working on bringing that synergies, that energies to keep studying comics, because the profession of comics is a group work. So scholars, artists, everyone bringing and opening a field that 20 years ago nobody was giving a dime for it. So we are so proud that this space is bringing the best people, the best artists, the best scholars to speak about comics and to keep vindicating the value of this field of study. So for us to have Qiana today open in the morning and speaking about her passion with her knowledge and her talent and her compassion and her generosity for all of us and for the profession is a pleasure. Thank you, Qiana, for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was so generous. Thank you so much. Awesome. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. What an introduction, kind of difficult to sit through, but I appreciate all the kind words, Anna and Corey. Rachel's not here, Esther, all the faculty and staff and students who've been so welcoming, and it has been really an honor to be a part of this experience and the start of the closing day. So I really am honored. Thank you all so much. So, as Anna mentioned, I wasn't hired at my current job to teach and study comics. I was hired to teach and study African American literature, which I still do and which I still enjoy reading and talking and teaching. One of my favorite novels to teach is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which many of you I'm sure know already, one of my favorites that I know like the back of my hand, which came out in 1952 and that I returned to quite a bit. At the start of my career, before that Chicago conference, I had the opportunity during the summers mostly to teach a comics class. It was on Neil Gaiman's Sandman, one of my another favorite. And a student brought to me a photocopy, black and white, of a comic called The Guilty, which was published by EC Comics in an issue of their Shock Suspense stories. And it was an amazing story, very short, 7 pages. It talked about a black man who was accused of murdering a white woman, and falsely accused, I should say, arrested and later killed by the sheriff shortly before the other person, the white man who committed the crime, confessed. It was one of EC's sort of classic surprise twist stories. And the student hands me this, and I'm like, what is this? Where did this come from? I start doing the research. Turns out, as I mentioned, it was published by EC and came out in 1952, right? So I'm looking at this, the same year as Ralph Ellison is doing his work and would go on to win the National Book Award. Here's a comic book that is engaged with some of those same interests and issues in the criminal justice system and racial justice and so forth. And I am amazed by the fact that here we have, again, these overlapping themes, but different modes of expression, different audiences, and arguably some different sort of marketing concerns, but the two don't often touch. And so that's one of the things that I try to do in my work, and that I did with, tried with that Swamp Thing paper so long ago. I love that essay, and I love Swamp Thing. So that's one of the things that I talk about in the book on EC Comics that I wrote a little while ago. The current project that I'm working on, and which was not supposed to be on shelves until next month, but clearly is, because Corey, you found it in a bookstore. It goes back even earlier and explores race and Blackness in comic books, comic strips, and editorial cartoons in the United States from the turn of the 20th century through the height of the industry's popularity in the 1950s. As many of you know, historically, comic books reached their zenith in circulation and profit during this period known as the Golden Age, starting in the late 30s, with publishers vying for in unprecedented ways for a slice of an industry that was reported to bring in $1 billion by 1953. Remember, this is before everybody had a TV, right? Business boomed in ways that for a time seemed to reward both the innovators and the imitators. So with the help of 15 other contributors in this collection that's out now, we hope to make the case that Black people are not, in a sense, latecomers or visitors to our understanding of comics and the comic book industry, but involved from the very start, as readers and consumers, as creators, as publishers, as fans. To give you a sense of what I mean, I'm going to go back to 1901. Take a look at this announcement. Well, it's not up yet, but this newspaper, The Colored American, a national newspaper based in Washington, D.C. On April 20th of that year, the newspaper editors reported that they had hired a cartoonist to create, quote, each week an original cartoon illustrating some feature of the race prejudice which exists in this country. That decision was followed by enthusiastic praise from Black newspaper editors across the country, and a few months later, the Colored American reprinted a notice from an Arkansas paper asking for more. Under this headline, The Power of Cartoons, the editor observed, quote, cartoons in journalism are far more powerful than many of our journalists seem to think. We wish the Negro press of the country could form a cartoon syndicate and thus be easily able for all Negro papers to furnish an apt cartoon once or twice a month or once a week on live questions. These cartoons would serve as eye-opener not only to the race, but they would attract the reading public in spite of prejudice and set the whole American people to thinking more deeply than Puck or Judge or Truth. So this piece gives us a glimpse into conversations that are clearly already happening in 1901, right? About how comics and cartoon art communicate about race through image and text. Who has the authority to take the reins of such a powerful visual rhetoric? How can it be used to capture the attention of readers who are accustomed to seeing Black people in the shallowest of ways? In particular, named here at the end of this editorial are Puck and Judge and Truth. As some of you know, these white-owned magazines were known for shaping the narrative around the all-too-common stereotypical portrayal of Black people through illustrated satire, week after week, on the landscape that another cartoonist, Frederick Burr Opper, once called caricature country. So these were the wildly popular illustrated magazines of the day. On comic strips in the newspapers, one of the form's earliest practitioners, R.F. Occult, is widely known for his depiction of urban panoramas transformed by immigrant communities in Hogan's Alley. So everybody knows Hogan's Alley, right, if you're taking a comics history class. But less well known are Occult's other two comic strips, The New Bully and Poor Little Mose, in which Black people were readily marked with those caricatures, the pitch black skin, the balloon lips, the bulging eyes, the drawling vernacular of racist caricature, and at every stage of their lives, as you can see here. Now, writer Jeet Heer has devoted a significant measure of his critical work on comics to contextualizing images like these. This is the new bully, also early 1900s. Early 1900s. Jeet Heer has contextualized images like these within the popular attitudes and power dynamics of late 19th century and early 20th century society. So as Heer explains, quote, "It is not just that cartoonists lived in a racist time, but also that the affinity of comics for caricature meant that the early comic strips took the existing racism of society and gave it vicious and virulent visual life." So as a result, the lens of racial stereotype has a wide scope in the comics industry and a long history of prompting and bolstering an already pervasive material culture in which Blackness is exploited as a vehicle for ridicule, shame, and pity. From washing powder and syrup advertisements to the illustrations and reading primers for small children, visual and verbal representations of Black people as buffoons and savages continue to circulate well into the 20th century. Now, in the early years of the comics industry, The Spirit, for example, I'm going to give some examples, Sunday newspaper supplement introduced the title character's Black sidekick, the taxi driver Ebony White. Dell Comics, The New Funnies featured the antics of Little 8-Ball alongside Raggedy Ann and Andy. And I know Raggedy Ann and Andy very well, but never heard of Little 8-Ball, also based on an animated cartoon. Jungle comics were another popular genre, very popular, and often dramatized the exploits of white adventurers in remote lands facing off against angry natives and ferocious animals, whether aimed at young audiences like Howdy Doody or older readers. Captain Marvel's Black Valet and Sidekick Steamboat was another fixture in this popular comic book series until 1945. And we know Captain Marvel today as Shazam. And if you enjoy the movies like I do, you don't see Steamboat in those movies. But here he is. And so in these moments, when I look at these images, I think about one of my favorite quotes by writer Charles Johnson, who's also a cartoonist, who cautions us. He says, "We should remember that the pictures we are looking at, these era images of Blacks, are a testament to the failure of the imagination and often of empathy too, and tell us nothing about Black people, but everything about what white audiences approved and felt comfortable with in pop culture until the 1950s. So all of these slides, all of these images, typically when we talk about this period, this is where we start and finish, right, with these stereotypes. I mean, all these slides I've shown you are slides I use in my own class when I talk about race and caricature. But if you take nothing away from my talk today, I'm hoping that you'll remember that when confronted with this kind of racist visual imperialism, which is a term I'm borrowing from my good friend Rebecca Wanzo, you'll remember that African American voices have always used comics to also demand something different. In the decades following that announcement I showed you in The Colored American, newspapers that served African Americans in cities such as Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York, Baltimore, and Tulsa would continue to hire their own cartoonists to create original work. So examples, Leslie Rogers, for instance, his Bungleton Green comic strip is one of the first to appear in an African-American newspaper in 1920. Jackie Orms, many of you know, thanks to the wonderful Deborah Whaley, who teaches here. She was one of the first Black women cartoonists to have a syndicated comic in the Pittsburgh Courier in the late 40s and 50s. And these are just a few in thinking about comic strips. So while the historical perception of Black people in comics during this early period has long been tied to caricatures of indecipherable minstrels, devious witch doctors, and brutal savages, the work that I'm trying to do with a community of scholars is to reveal a more complex narrative and aesthetic landscape, one that was enriched by the negotiations among comic artists, writers, editors, distributors, and readers over how Blackness should be portrayed. Large mainstream and small presses expressed an interest in multiracial audiences. And on occasion, artists and writers experimented with new ways to portray Black lives in a medium deeply connected to legacies of racist objectification. Now, among studies that were completed during the golden age of consumers, Black boys and girls were among the most devoted readers, often purchasing and sharing a larger selection of comics than their white counterparts. So in other words, I mention all of this to say that it isn't just the interest of these readers that matter, it is also these. And these are some images that I love, 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 Gordon Parks and Teenie Harris, which I'll talk about a bit later. So one of the points that I don't think is emphasized enough, and again in our discussion of early comics history, is the fact that the earliest and most prolific decades of the industry in the United States also correspond with the Jim Crow era. And so understanding how comics took part in the debates over Blackness also means raising questions about access, ideology, and the politics of interracial contact, both in the panels and on the shelves. The period was marked by the advent of Black codes, laws enacted after the Civil War to restrict the rights and behaviors of African Americans, mostly in the South. These practices were expanded after Reconstruction to codify white supremacy across the country by disenfranchising Black voters and sanctioning acts of vigilante terrorism, such as lynching, to maintain social control. By the time the United States confronted the Great Depression and World War II, the racial divide had become enmeshed in the everyday routines of life, where restricted access to housing, transportation, medical care, and leisure was the norm. And so, not surprisingly then, every stage of the process of creating, distributing, and purchasing comics was impacted to some degree by the laws and customs of racial segregation. The struggle to negotiate the era's racial restrictions also made their way into the comics themselves. So I want you to consider, I know it's kind of tiny up there, this satirical comic strip called Mr. Jim Crow that was created by Chicago Defender staff artist Garrett White. It was published in the newspaper's national edition from 1946 to 1951 to capture what he called the, quote, ineptitude of segregation. The strip's title character was a white politician from the South with the beak of a crow, whose insistence on the strict divide between the races led to absurd ends. Adorned in a suit with a pompadour haircut and a plantation string tie, you probably recognize his overbearing demeanor and Southern drawl is reminiscent of fictional Senator Beauregard Claghorn from the Fred Allen Show. One installment, pictured here, follows Mr. Jim Crow as he gives away free sheets and pillow slips to men and children of different sizes and boasts in the final panel about the best way to use the linens, while behind him a parade of Ku Klux Klansmen walks by. Now, in the strip's later years, White invited readers to, as you can see, win $5 cash by sending in accounts of their, quote, own personal experiences or observations showing the amusing side of segregation or discrimination, the amusing side. Subsequent comics noted that names of the weekly winners whose real-life encounters were dramatized in the strip. A California reader supplied the details of an August 27, 1949 strip about Mr. Jim Crow's visit to a ranch, where he makes a point to note his dislike for Black cattle. He demands that the African-American ranch hand roll him a cigarette, but stops him from finishing the job, saying, quote, colored boy, I do my own licking. The ranch hand's retort, quote, and Jim Crow, I do my own kicking, appears in the final panel above a silhouette of the Black man's fists and boot lifting the shocked crow into the air. Right, this is 49. I find this really cool. White leverages here the critical perspective of satire in Mr. Jim Crow against the invocation of actual events and readers whose experiences with racism are the subject of the strip. Fact meets fiction in the bizarre caricature of a man-sized crow who talks and squawks about the convoluted means through which the separation of races must be maintained. Since Mr. Jim Crow is not the only white man in the comic, White's visual depiction as a crow of him as a crow creates a cognitive dissonance around his daily encounters with human beings that brings unspoken anti-Black attitudes to the surface. Mr. Jim Crow gets the last laugh in most of these stories, but for this visit to the California ranch, White uses the last panel to stage an additional ending with the kind of punchline that most African Americans would not have been able to execute in 1949 without serious consequences. The ironic twist of the colored boy who kicks back provides a cathartic reward for the comic strip's weekly winner and all those who have shared a similar humiliation. So here we see the Chicago Defender providing a space not only to critique larger power structures, but also to creatively resist and revise the seemingly small racial interactions that readers faced every day. So this isn't a newspaper, this is a comic strip. On the pages of comic books during the 40s and 50s, we see an unprecedented number of titles about African American life, history, sports, and love. Short-lived titles like Fawcett's Negro Romance appeared during this time specifically to attract Black readers. There's an awesome chapter in the book about Negro romance and its efforts to do that. More common, this one lasted for 3 issues, but more common were sports comics and biographical titles that focused on well-known African American figures. This one in the top left is a short comic on Sojourner Truth that appeared at the end of a Wonder Woman comic as part of an ongoing series. Negro Heroes, which I'll talk about in a second. Of course, Jackie Robinson, he's got his own comic, he had a couple. And Joe Louis had his as well in 1950. Among the more visible firsts in this crowd, though, is All Negro Comics, written and published by Philadelphia journalist Orrin C. Evans in 1947. And it's this comic, this one in the center, that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, spend the rest of my time focusing on. Who here is familiar with All Negro Comics? First time hearing this? Okay, good. Okay. It is in the public domain now, so it's available online. You can download it. I can also send you a PDF. It's going to be reprinted for its 75th anniversary this year as well, so very cool. And so with that, All Negro Comics is celebrated as the first comic to be written, illustrated, and published by and about African Americans in the United States. Beneath the headline of Evans's opening editorial, presenting another first, quote, in Negro history, he declares that the drawings are original, that the humor and fantasy are good and clean, that's important, and that the pages will satisfy comics consumers with fast action. Evans scripted these stories and recruited the talents of freelance cartoonist John H. Terrell, along with students from the Philadelphia Museum of Art School, William H. Smith, Leonard Cooper, and his brother George J. Evans, Jr. With their contributions, the publisher was able to boast that, quote, every brushstroke and pen line in these drawings on these pages are by Negro artists. Now, only issue number 1 was printed and sold. It featured a full-color anthology of crime, adventure, fantasy, and humor stories. Note, no superheroes. We can talk about that later if you like. But they were all created to disrupt the popular and profitable racial caricatures that continue to circulate in the comic book industry after World War II, in which I've already shown you some examples of. So you open this comic and you see first Ace Harlem, a Black detective who investigates the case of the Zoot chain killers in the city. Ace's story is followed by a playful sojourn in the make-believe world of the Dew Dillies. Sort of a kid's entry here, cherubic creatures of the sea and sky. In another tale that's going to sound very, very familiar, a young African-American scientist named Lion Man protects the African Gold Coast and its volatile uranium deposits from outsiders. And in the closing story, Sugarfoot and his companion Snake Oil travel the rails in search of adventure and a hot meal. And alongside those 4 features, there were 2 one-page comic strips and cartoon art featuring Hep Chicks on Parade and Little Eggy. right? So you got a little bit of everything in here. Country, city, all sorts of things. Now, the debut issue of All Negro Comics captured substantial media attention. By Time, Washington Post, Collier's had an announcement, Atlanta Daily World, Chicago Defender, Baltimore Afro-American, and more. The press marveled at Evans's initiative and remarked upon the wonders of, quote, America's first Negro comic book. Even Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in her weekly syndicated column, quote, I must say that as I glanced through the pages of this newcomer, I felt that it compared very favorably with the best of the comic books. In some features, it is really better. That's high praise. Now, appearing only a few months before All Negro Comics was this one, the comic I've shown before, Negro Heroes. And this comic on the right was a collaboration between Parents Magazine Press, the Urban League, and Delta Sigma Theta sorority. It also claimed that title of being the first all-Negro comic magazine. The difference here is that Negro Heroes published reprinted stories from previous Heroes magazines or comics that they had published, whereas All Negro Comics was original material and completely illustrated and written by African Americans. So, I mean, we can fight it out about who's first, but both of these obviously were very important. The other thing I would add in terms of the comparison is that the first issue of All Negro Comics, as you can see, sold for 15 cents. That was a big deal because most comics at the time are selling for a dime. It had 48 interior pages, so it was a bit longer, but still more expensive. So sales were slow for All Negro Comics. And Evans aggressively promoted his comic. As I mentioned before, he was a journalist, so he had access to media ties. He even enlisted student salespeople and offered to send the issue to schools that served African American youth, ensuring more reliable direct distribution for future monthly installments. So whether All Negro Comics circulated mostly on newsstands or in classrooms, it boldly piqued the reader's interest, or made an attempt to, by taking advantage of the decade's trend in targeting a single subject through the all comics compilation style. And you can see here, we've got your all top comics, your all American comics, your all teen, your all funny, your all star, your all great comics. And these are just from June 1947 alone, just the 6 I could fit on the slide. So this was a common strategy for publishing these comics anthologies. To attract attention in a congested market, Evans and his collaborators implemented a familiar assortment of visual and verbal strategies, including conspicuous branding, an ensemble cast, promotional teasers, and direct appeal to readers. I love the way on the cover, the scene is drawn in such a way where it looks like all of the characters are bursting through a black page, and you can see the sort of leaves of the page folding back. So they tried to get creative with it and succeeded, I think. Along the way inside, a succession of interior and exterior scenes transports us into places like Pop's Barbecue Shack, or to the local herbalist, Dr. Ali Bin, a man of mystery. Ace Harlem here, for instance, visits Jackson's boarding house next beside a fish market on a busy street. In these moments, the sequences that connect the narrative are significant as a cross-section of community comes into view that expands our view of the visual scope of Blackness in comics. Such creative choices would elicit praise from the Baltimore Afro-American commentator who was eager to see the, quote, casual viewpoint of the average Afro-American in which daily situations arising from open or latent Jim Crow could be dramatized. On the other hand, a reviewer from the Chicago Defender criticized All Negro Comics as, quote, a commercial venture with no social story to tell, and directly contrasted it with Negro Heroes. So these reviews are a reminder, basically, of the kind of dueling attitudes and opinions about how the politics of representation are being informed here by certain visual connections and discursive inferences in these comics. And I think that conflict works well with the theme of racial reckoning that we're here talking about today. One reporter in particular from Time magazine commented on the villains in Ace Harlem and said, quote, "The villains were a couple of zoot-suited, jive-talking Negro muggers whose presence in anyone else's comic might have brought up complaints of racial distortion. Since it was all in the family, Evans thought no Negro readers would mind." And I love things like this because here we're seeing all of the kind of tensions come through and thinking about how do we represent African Americans on the page? Can we have Black villains, for instance? It's likely that readers during this time would have thought about the connotations associated with zoot suits during the 40s and 50s, right? But they might have also, especially young readers, thought about The Young Allies, which was a timely comic, later Marvel, including Bucky Barnes and one of his companions, Whitewash Jones, also a zoot-suited Black teen with the balloon lips of a minstrel and a love for watermelon. So there are visible differences between these two comics, but herein lies the danger, right, for the collaborators of all Negro comics, as their efforts to build compelling character types runs the risk of perpetuating the exaggerations and misrepresentations of caricature. How does a comic designed to defy racist images avoid enabling the distortions that are so deeply embedded in the form's narrative and aesthetic traditions? So to my mind, what is perhaps most daring in this regard is Evans' decision to immerse his characters in fictional genres, including slapstick comedy and adventure that had frequently been used to denigrate people of color. Comic book publishers tended to answer such complaints with titles like Negro Heroes, which focused on historical leaders and sports figures and sought to avoid the distortions by adhering to facts and stats. And here I'm thinking about Professor Scott's talk yesterday because I'm thinking about, publishers choosing realism. They want to stay away from fantasy because they don't want to be accused of being racist. But we see instead this first issue of All Negro Comics choosing escapist storytelling, choosing to invite readers to see a glimpse of themselves in the comic's laughter, in its awe and shock. So, as a result, characters like these villains, or in another story, the young sidekick in Lion Man, his name is Bubba, they expose crucial fault lines between multiple and sometimes opposing ways of reading Blackness in the comic. They illustrate how collaborators behind All Negro Comics attempted to wrestle free of racial stereotypes while working within the boundaries of genre and convention. Let me check my time here, okay. So today, Evans' comics also serves as a reminder that what's new in comics is often not as important as what's next, especially for an art form that relies on sequential narrative to make meaning. Located throughout All Negro Comics are paratextual signposts that seek to generate excitement in readers about what's next. So you can see it all over. Look for Ace Harlem in the next issue of All Negro Comics. Watch for All Negro Comics on the newsstands. Look for Sugarfoot and Snake Oil in the next issue. It's all over all of the stories. But there was no next issue of All Negro Comics. Those of you who are familiar with this history know that if the second issue was written, if it was drawn, it was never published. A 1997 account by the comics historian Tom Christopher is widely used as our main source material for our current knowledge about what happened to the second issue. The details of which have circulated through other history since. So Christopher writes, quote, "A second issue was planned and the art completed. But when Orrin was ready to publish, he found that his source for newsprint would no longer sell to him, nor would any of the other vendors he contacted. He was not a man given to conspiratorial thinking, but his family remembers that his belief was that there was pressure being placed on the newsprint wholesalers by bigger publishers and distributors who didn't welcome any intrusions on their established territories." So during this period when All Negro Comics is published, it's not uncommon for a series run to be abruptly discontinued or confined to a single issue or two, as publishers carefully tracked resources, rates of distribution, and competitors from month to month. I mean, that still happens, right? Golden Age publishers were willing to give comic books featuring African Americans a chance in an attempt to serve a wider audience and to generate greater revenue. But these were not long-term investments, deserving of large marketing budgets or targeted distribution strategies. Evans's correspondence suggests that encouraging vendors to sell and promote his comic was an uphill battle, despite his contacts in the media. However, in his enterprising efforts to reach Black schools and neighborhoods and to enlist young readers as salespeople, he specifically stated that the comic was soon to be issued on a regular monthly basis. The story of what happened to all Negro comics was not tied solely to underperforming sales or to war-era shortages of paper, but more likely to systemic discriminatory practices, to racial bigotry and fear of competition. It is not just that Evans did not possess the economic and social currency needed to gain access to newsprint, but also that the vendors who refused to do business with him collectively deprived his periodical of an even more valuable resource, time. Time to build on the first issue success, to finance the creative talent and sustain the audience's anticipation. Time to keep the comic on the newsstands before making room for what's next. All right? Evans' experience demonstrates, in other words, that serialization for an all-cartoon magazine could be a privilege, an exclusive advantage that all Negro comics was denied. So ironically, 1947, the year that we're talking about here, was also the same time that the white-owned New York publisher called EC, or Entertaining Comics, would start their own experimentation with horror, like Tales from the Crypt, which many of us are familiar with, or satirical comics like Mad, which I used to love as a kid, and other popular genres like crime and science fiction and war comics. As already been mentioned, my first book focuses on EC, and I talk about this influential type of story called the preachies, that EC's writers and artists developed to directly engage problems that Americans faced during the early Cold War and civil rights eras. So I take a closer look at how some of these comics confront racial prejudice, religious intolerance, anti-communist rhetoric, and other forms of discrimination. The same moment that people like Orrin C. Evans are doing their work, we also see EC publishing stories like The Slave Ship. This is from Weird Fantasy number 8 in 1951, in which the sailors who are transporting a cargo of African people are themselves enslaved by a spaceship of aliens. You can see it there right alongside the boat. The Guilty, this is the story that the student I mentioned handed to me all those many years ago from Shock Suspense Stories number 3, which focuses on this Black man falsely accused of murder. Judgment Day, the science fiction story that first appeared in Weird Fantasy number 18, features a Black astronaut sent to inspect a planet of orange and blue segregated robots. One of my favorites. And Perimeter, from Frontline Combat number 15, captures the tensions among white and Black American soldiers in newly integrated platoons during the Korean War. So as I talk about in the book, EC fans have long been known to praise the company as being the first to talk about racism and its impact on American society. But now you all know, you've seen glimpses of a larger community and a larger conversation that's been happening. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the fact that at the same time, EC is selling their work, if you go to a newsstand that you're going to pick up a copy of Weird Fantasy and that vendor is selling Negro Romance or a comic book with Jackie Robinson on the cover, they're also selling Jungle Comics, right? They're also selling newspapers that have the final installments of The Spirit with Ebony White. All of these different conflicts and tensions are sort of converging and happening at once in this moment. How might, and here's the question that I'm trying to ask, these mid-century readers make meaning out of the competing codes of strength, justice, and power that they're encountering all at the same time? So I'm coming to my my close, I promise. In 1945, a group of multiracial junior high school students from New York called the Youth Builders visited Fawcett's executive editor, Will Lieberson, to make the case against Captain Marvel's steamboat. According to comic scholar Brian Crimmins, the group held up an enlarged image of the caricatured sidekick and stated, quote, "This is not the Negro race, but your 1.5 million readers will think it so." The steamboat was discontinued shortly after that. Jeet Heer's research uncovered an exchange between an editor at King Features Syndicate and cartoonist Roy Crane 2 years earlier over the appearance of Black characters in 2 installments of the adventure comic strip Buzz Sawyer. Crane was cautioned against including such images because, quote, "Experience has shown us that we have to be awfully careful about any comics in which Negroes appear. The Association for the Advancement of Colored People protests every time they see anything which they consider ridicules the Negro, no matter how faintly." In 1947, a group of Black schoolchildren wrote to Dell Comics editor Oscar Lebeck about Little 8-Ball. Their complaints, along with pressure from the Cultural Division of the National Negro Congress, led Lebeck to discontinue that character. And so we have undeterred young people faced with the customs of caricature country that call into question the naming power of the industry and the role of all its creative professionals in shaping attitudes about Blackness. Now, of course, not every comic featuring a racist character generated letter-writing campaigns and visits from civil rights organizations or resulted in the hiring of more Black cartoonists. But without these examples, our picture of US comics history is incomplete. So when it comes to these foundational years, I keep returning to the picture of that young Black girl here in Teenie Harris's photo, sitting in front of the rows and rows of comic books. As some of you know already, this photograph that was taken by Teenie Harris actually was in 1947, again, same year as All Negro Comics came out. It was taken inside a confectionery store owned by Harris's older brother, George Harris. The unnamed comic book reader in the photos, you can see she's got a dog stretched across her lap. To her left and right are pulp detective tales, romance stories, newspapers, while behind her rise shelves and shelves of comic books. This shop was located in the heart of Pittsburgh's predominantly Black Hill District on Wiley Avenue, and the picture, taken during the business district's most prosperous years after World War II, reflected a larger attempt on the part of Harris to spotlight cheerful, optimistic moments that called attention to, quote, "a side of Black life not usually portrayed in the white media." As with so many built spaces during the era of segregation, the Wiley Avenue confectionery store was part of a society that was partitioned in ways that sought to deny the full humanity of African Americans. Yet what Harris manages to capture here with this young girl is a moment of respite from Mr. Jim Crow, right? An interior space encapsulated by an astonishing abundance of reading pleasures. The photograph invites us to view this bounty of stacked and overlapping comic books as so much more than a golden age of productivity and profit. The newsstand also functions as a saddle-stitch inner zone in the popular representation of race. Its shelves showcase the round of marketing gambits and creative breakthroughs, clashing ideologies and attitudes, and insurgent readerships that distinguish the debates over Blackness in early American comics. This analogy of the comic book newsstand is a fitting one, I think, for understanding how such a transformational period in our nation's social and political history also proved to be so pivotal for the comic book industry. Thank you so much. There's a little poet there. Sorry. I don't know how much time we have for questions.
We have sometimes with questions. Such a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. And I love these pictures, and I love that it's done in the Hill District. I worked there when I was finished my last year
Is
of
that
my
right?
PhD thesis on comics at Pittsburgh.
So you know where
Yeah,
this is.
I know that area, yes, because I was in Miller Elementary School, and I was working in a project of capoeiristas with Capoeira Angola, the Queen Singa project with the community.
Wow.
And you were in Brazil, so I like the connection. So I forgot to mention that Qiana was teaching in Brazil. So I love this round. Presentation was fantastic. There is time for questions. Go ahead. I know it was an amazing presentation. We are recording.
Okay. So you mentioned television, and this is the beginning of television, and obviously both forms are visual,
Yes.
and hence a lot more popular. More people had access to this stuff. And my impression is that television sort of things were beginning to open up. I get the feeling in the realm of comics. But then television comes in and it seems to close the space throughout the 50s, really until the late 50s, maybe early 60s, when things begin to open up again. Do you see that or that connection? Or
Things are closing in comics? Well, I mean, so one of the things that if I had another hour, right, I would talk about is the comics code, right? So the debates over comics that sort of come to a head in 1954 lead to Frederick Wertham, who I cut the part about Frederick Wertham, the psychiatrist who talked about the harm, the so-called harm that comics caused on young people and the cause of juvenile delinquency. There were Senate hearings, and so publishers sort of got together to come up with a form of self-regulation, a comics code that put restrictions on what could appear on the page. And they had a line about restrictions about racial and religious groups, and how a lot of publishers read that was, we're not going to talk about race anymore. And it meant that for many comics, you didn't see that kind of experimentation that I talked about in Negro Romance or the Jackie Robinson. You didn't see that as much. You did have some civil rights groups who would publish one-off, you know, the Martin Luther King Jr. comic, if any of you are familiar with that one, came out in '58. NAACP published a few comics, but mainstream publishers were staying away from those conversations during the late 50s and early 60s, and a lot of it went underground. So you do definitely see television is rising, but also the industry is being squeezed in a way that I would say discouraged that kind of experimentation that I think was really terrific about some of the 40s and 50s comics. So, yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you for this fantastic talk. I really appreciate your kind of move to disrupt the kind of dominating view of the archive to show the very resistant ways that racialized communities were working. And I'm curious, I'm thinking through this in my own work. I was struck by a few places the representations of indigeneity or the kind of Native American stereotypes that are showing up in the comics. And I'm trying to think through the complexities, especially in the early 20th century. There's so much instability around whiteness, but there's also this complex kind of ecosystem of racist caricatures that are circulating that borrow on each other, that are anti-Black, that are anti-Indigenous. My research is on South Asians, that similarly, like anti-brownness is being given kind of persuasive force through anti-Black, anti-Indigenous logic. So I'm curious if this might be beyond the scope of what you're looking at, but I'd love to hear you talk a bit about the intersections between, you know, like on the cover of that first all Negro comics, one that you showed, some of the Black characters are in kind of more stereotypical Native American kind of caricatures. And I don't know how, I mean, there's a lot of complexity to that sort of representation. So I'm wondering how, if you kind of looked into that, or if there's any part of that that came up in your research, because I just find that really interesting when you're talking about this like comic as a really resistive space to kind of for African Americans to kind of reappropriate and take up representation. How does that kind of intersection between those things play out for you?
Well, and I thank you for that question, because you're picking up on actually some of those tensions, the conflict and the clashes that we see going on with all Negro comics and its attempt to both work its way into what readers are very familiar with seeing in white-produced comics, as well as bring Black faces to it. And so, like with the example with the Zoot Suit killers, you know, they're trying to play into common narrative tropes and characterizations that would have appeared in so many comics during the time, but they want to put Black characters at the center. Now, it sounds like you're also talking about Lion Man. You mentioned indigeneity, and Bubba here, which is supposed to be West African characters. There are a lot of stereotypes in this comic as well. When I teach it, we spend a lot of time talking about Snake Oil and Sugarfoot, and it's very problematic representations of women and their objectification. Women do not fare well at all in this comic, and it's unfortunate and sad. We can talk about those efforts to, in a sense, if you want to call it, be progressive in some ways and regressive in others, and again, play into what was common, and by common I don't mean excused, during that day. So that's there. A lot of those, I mean, I think people sometimes when they talk about characters like Black Panther, for instance, forget that that character comes out of Jungle Comics traditions. It's a horribly racist tradition. Those comics are some of the worst. I think Professor Scott mentioned, was it Fanon who started talking about Tarzan? And those were some of the most problematic comics, extremely popular. And when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby decided to pull their character kind of out of that tradition and do something different with it, they bring all this baggage with them as well. And so, yeah, I don't know if that helps to speak a little bit to some of the challenges in analyzing this.
It's interesting too that you mentioned some of the characters were maybe drawing on West African. I mean, there's something about the intersections between like trying to draw on Black indigenous tropes, but the ways that they're read in a U.S. racist context, right? Where those things that were maybe trying to be subversive and drawing on Black tropes of Black indigeneity are read through potentially those anti-indigenous tropes in the United States, which is, it's a really, like you said, it's very complex, but really interesting.
Yeah. And he's specifically African American too, right? Like he's from the UN, which just formed. It's really complicated. So thank you for that.
So you mentioned earlier on that all Negro comics had to be clean, and that part of the distribution strategy that Evan set out on was to get it into schools to, like, you know, prop up the market for this representation through a sort of educational lens, that it was showing a different side of Negro life in America, that it, like, but in effect, it still trafficked in a lot of the same tropes that were used to establish, like, you know, evil Black characters, and in doing so, drew a lot of criticism from Black critics as well. And I know that, like, you've represented throughout this talk a sort of visual discourse where, like, the visual elements of Blackness ascribed by white supremacy are sort of interceded upon by Black comic artists and authors that start to create their own stories that start to represent Black people in their own ways. And I'm wondering if, like, there are any voices missing from this visual discourse. Like, the criticism that's leveled at Evans is making the, you know, Zoot Suit muggers, you know, the just standard Black, anti-Black trope. It feels like there is potential for another way of representing Black people, a third one that has not been highlighted either in the tradition of white supremacist representations in caricature country, or in the sort of response to lift up examples of Black joy, or in the case of the Negro heroes, Black excellence. I'm wondering, like, is there another visual representational strategy that you've come across?
Like a third way. historically during this time, different other entries sort of that don't try to ascribe to either of those strategies that you mentioned? I mean, I think, oh, that's a good question. I am admittedly sort of cherry picking certain issues and images because they're not this is not the norm, right? And they don't sell as well, but they do have enough of an impact that we see people trying to copy or to build on. I would say I'm inclined to want to move a little bit forward into the 50s and talk again more about some of those things that I mentioned some of the civil rights groups were doing, as well as what was happening in African American newspapers that were having entirely different conversations than what's happening here. And in some ways, Evans's style is he's trying to pull from what the newspapers are doing and piece it together into a comic book. Because remember, the newspapers had comic strips serialized since the 20s. And there is a whole other tradition there that didn't feel the need to justify this is good, clean fun, because it was very well regarded. The Courier was one of the first black newspapers in the 1950s to have their own color comic section for a couple of years. That's where the Jackie Orms strip comes from. And when people were arguing about comics and their impact on juvenile delinquency, you know, the newspaper editors would be like, yeah, that should be discussed, that should be addressed. But they never had that conversation about their own comics because people weren't complaining about those. They were very welcome to continue circulating in the way that they had. So it kind of feels like, this is my long way of saying, there's different strains of conversation happening about the impact of comics and so-called positive representations. And if there was a third way, perhaps those newspapers might be it. I mean, a lot of people pull out comic strips as separate from the comic book conversation. But I mean, anyway, I'm rambling. But that always fascinates me. Like the complaints never seem to reach the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, during all of those years. So that would be what I would offer. It would be nice to have more women cartoonists. I feel like that would be a fourth way that we just don't get as much in comic books. But yeah, so.
And one last question.
Well, let me say again, this is just absolutely fascinating and crucial. I wanted to ask if you might say a little more about how you see the role, and I can imagine, again, the tensions that are operative in the sports comics and the sports stories. And on one hand, it reminds me of just, this point that comes up very emphatically in Do the Right Thing, that you can have a white racist, but who says, their favorite athlete is a black athlete or their favorite performer is a black performer. And so that may have been, in a sense, the audience for Jackie Robinson or Willie Mays or Joe Louis comics, the white audience that admires sports figures but otherwise, has no interest in black detectives or black romance. But it is fascinating just in terms of the timeline that, from a mainstream company, they do Jackie Robinson comics when Jackie Robinson is integrating baseball. And so all of the debates around, the integration of baseball are the context for that sports comic at least, and maybe the others as well. But I just wonder if you could say more about, and I'm aware, in addition to the the featured stories, there are a lot of stories in other comics that feature black athletes.
Yeah, there's, I realize sports manga is very popular, but when it comes to American comics, I don't think we see sports comics the way we did in the 50s and the 40s. The way that, you're right, this is the place where I think publishers felt the safest. There was a potential crossover appeal. Jackie Robinson is integrating baseball and doing all of these things that are considered to be things that we should showcase, especially for young people. What Fawcett was doing, Brian has a really good chapter on the sports comic around Roy Campanella, and how when they ended Steamboat, they increased their number of sports comics. So it was their way of saying, this is how we push back against the complaints and the critics, to be able to bring in what, again, feels like it wouldn't be as safe during this moment, because there are a lot of people who were against that integration of baseball, but was considered to be a role model for kids. The Jackie Robinson series was one of the longest. It had 5 or 6 issues, and I was saying yesterday, it starts with his statistics and all of his plays, and ends with him like catching cat burglars and running around with kids solving crime. You know, so very few of these sports comics lasted very long. They ran out of things to talk about, but they were Joe Louis, and then I mentioned the Roy one. Fawcett really kind of went all in on using that as the counter narrative for Steamboat, which, you know, and others that were definitely more popular and making a lot of money during that time. Yeah. So it is really interesting. They do much better than the Negro heroes. I mean, everybody wants to read about George Washington Carver, maybe. Feels a little like school. I don't know. But Jackie Robinson has those sports figures have a different appeal.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Qiana. It was a fantastic talk.